Hi, so I wanted to cover this game for a while. It's pretty nostalgic for me and it's been a really long time since I played it, which sometimes, as I've covered before, nostalgia has a lovely way of making things seem like they were better than they were. Also, I'm going to be chatting about the two different versions of Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars. The original release all the way back from 1996, which in my opinion still has some charm to it even to this day, though it does have some flaws. And the director's cut, released in 2009, which I have a few constructive opinions on, but I'm going to try and not bash too hard, though it might seem like I do for reasons I'll explain later. So Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars is a point-and-click adventure game where you play as a character called George Stobart, an American tourist, who gets himself involved in an international conspiracy when a clown plants a bomb that explodes in a cafe he's sitting by. The game had a pretty good launch trailer when it was released in 1996, which was voiced by Barry Clayton.
Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars. An innocent vacation in Paris unwittingly whisks young American George Stobart away on a mysterious and compelling escapade, which could change the fate of man.
Who was also famous for doing the intro to the Iron Maiden song The Number of the Beast. Oh, and the intro to Count Duckula. The game was developed by Revolution Software headed by Charles Cecil, who got the idea for the game over a bottle of wine while chatting to Sean Brennan in a restaurant in London in 1993. Charles was pitching the idea of a game set in Egypt with hieroglyphs to Sean Brennan, who was vice president of Virgin Active at the time. To which Sean basically said, "Nah mate, Egyptian games don't sell, what else you got?" So they got talking more and eventually the topic of the Knight Templars came up, which turns out have a very rich history that's kind of perfect for the foundations of an adventure game. And so the concept for the game Broken Sword was born. Charles began to do in-depth research about the Templars, which isn't how it is now, where you could easily just Google stuff. Back then it was buy a book about it or go to the library to read about it. Though Charles went the extra mile and actually visited a lot of the places that were significant to the Templars, like Paris, which is the main setting for the game. His research helped to shape the real made-up locations in the game, while going over the story with Revolution's writing team. He tried to include as many real details as he could to try and help with the believability and the drama of the story, such as lost Templar treasure and secret catacombs linked with sewers underneath Paris, which became some of the main elements in the game. With the main setting sorted, the team at Revolution now had to come up with characters for the game. The main two characters being George Stobart, an American tourist, and Nico Collard, a French photojournalist, who both get involved in a major conspiracy that they unravel together. This also leads to them developing a relationship as the player goes through the game. In the original game, the player just played as George, though in the director's cut they add sections where you play as Nico, which I don't think is a bad idea. It's just that what they added didn't really improve things. You'll notice these additions as the newer and older art styles clash with each other. Like the mime punch at the start of the director's cut, it's memorable and probably not for reasons that I think were intended. The rest of the new section feels like a bit of a drawn out prologue that does give some interesting backstory to Nico, but feels like it slows the pacing down before getting to the main inciting incident of the game. Being a clown assassin blowing up a cafe in Paris. I mean, that combination of words already has me interested. Okay, but before I get into the story, let's get into how the game runs. The director's cut is fairly easy to get to run. The only issue is the in-game text, which is really tiny and I could barely see what was written. But there is a fix for that, where you just need to replace the in-game text file, which I'll put a link to in the description below. Now, the original game, I'll be a bit honest, I was dreading about getting to work, as those of you who know the struggle of getting older games to run might understand. The original game was released on MS-DOS, that already sent my mind racing, so okay, it's probably going to need some form of virtualization maybe, and hopefully there are some fan-made mods and patches out there to help run at a reasonable resolution. Ugh. But before going down that crazy Google rabbit hole, I thought let's just start up and see if my PC explodes. It'll be fun. And the craziest thing happened. To quote a snake oil salesman,
"All of this just works."
the game started out fine with no issues. What crazy voodoo magic was this? It turns out these guys named Ludwig Strigus and Vincent Ham in 2001 created the software called ScumVM that recreates older game engines so that they can run on newer platforms. Nice. So that's how they got it to run. It's helped a lot of older games get a chance to be played by newer audiences that otherwise wouldn't have had the chance to. Like the Blade Runner point-and-click adventure game made by Westwood. Now the game is still from 1996, so you're not going to get crisp HD visuals, but the older look has some charm to it, and some gamers might enjoy that. This is where some key differences from the original and the director's cut comes in. The original game, in my opinion, has a very distinctive style, which I liked. When I first played it, it reminded me of old Disney movies or that old arcade game Dragon's Lair, which you don't see much of nowadays. Turns out Charles Cecil hired some animators and background artists from Sullivan Bluth Studios to help make the game. Now maybe you don't know Sullivan Bluth Studios, but you might have heard of some of the classic movies they've made, like The Secret of Nim, An American Tale, and The Land Before Time, but not including the apparent billion sequels this movie has, which I found out while researching. Geez, how many times do you people want dinosaurs to make make you cry. Don Bluth, being a founder at the studio, had previously worked at Disney and was very much influenced by his time there. He really liked the Disney style of older animation, which went on to influence the people who worked at his studio. Also, it turns out Southern Bluth Studios did the animation work for Dragon's Lair. Like, no wonder I was getting that vibe from the game when playing it. The animations in the original is great in my opinion. It gives personality to the setting and makes the characters lively and more interesting. Now, the director's cut doesn't do that so much. As you can see, we go from this to this. Which, let's not sugarcoat it, the director's cut animations look like it belongs in a mid-2000 Flash web game. It's stiff and doesn't really match the game's original art style. Speaking of art style, the artist that got to do the new art for the director's cut was Dave Gibbons, who did the art for the Watchmen comics. Which I mean is some great art and the guy is really talented, but I don't think the style works well with what was in the original game. That's my opinion of course, and I'm sure some of you might disagree with me. But for me the ideal remake of this game would stick to the original art style more, which would be kinda hard to pull off considering there's so little 2D stuff that's done at present in gaming. Since it's just easier to make things in 3D now. I mean, they even added 3D models to the director's cut, which is super noticeable to me. But game developers have been figuring ways around this. Like, look at the stuff Arc System Works is doing in animations in games. At times you can't tell that their game models are 3D, and it looks so good that actual animation studios are using their techniques. Imagine if they use that for a remake of Broken Sword. Though that's maybe me daydreaming too much, as there's probably technical and art style differences that wouldn't allow it to work. But I can dream, right? There is at least some consistency between the two versions of the game, and that's the music, which mostly stays the same between both versions, with some, from what I can remember, non-intrusive additions to the director's cut. It's great at setting the mood for all the locations of the game, and is generally fun for me to listen to. From the streets of Paris, to Nico's apartment, to an Irish pub. It mostly keeps you in a calm state when dealing with tricky puzzles. One especially dealing with an infamous goat, which I'll chat about later. The only things I could critique is the voiceover recording, which in the original is mostly consistent, but in the director's cut is a bit all over the place in quality, as it gets a bit noticeable when lines are added. And the audio mixing isn't great at times in both versions. You might want to turn down the music down at times to hear what's being said. Also, the director's cut makes some odd additions, like mixing accents from all over the world in the main French setting. Like Nico's boss and editor is an American.
Collard, get your ass over to the Palais Royal now.
But maybe she works for an international paper or something. What's the name of the paper?
La Liberté.
Okay, maybe not. But it might be me nitpicking, as the original did this a little bit with some characters, like the secretary at the French hospital and the cleaner there too. Generally, the voice acting in the game is great, if a bit cheesy at times, which it needed to be to carry the slightly odd but fun humor, which sometimes has a more serious tone to it, like murder and international conspiracies. Though the game doesn't take itself too seriously, as remember, the story starts off with a clown blowing up a French cafe with an accordion bomb, but somehow manages to balance this bit of goofiness with an engaging story, which it mostly gets right with both versions of the game, but I think the original is superior, as you could die in the original game multiple ways. Some of them were even a bit funny. However, the director's cut doesn't let you die, which kind of takes away some tension when going through the story, and it even tones down the violence a bit by removing blood from some scenes, which is a choice. Okay, so I said I wasn't going to bash the director's cut too much, and I think I've only failed at that slightly. But why I didn't want to bash it too hard was because the director's cut is the reason Revolution Software is still around to make games. After releasing sequels of Broken Sword during the late 90s and early 2000s, the demand for point-and-click adventure games had fallen, and the general state of gaming was everything must be 3D now because publishers only know how to follow trends. It kind of forced Revolution into making changes to the series that maybe didn't gel well with fans. So after Broken Sword 4, Revolution wasn't doing so hot. They were close to bankrupt. But some fans of Broken Sword petitioned to get the game on the Wii and DS, which is when Charles Cecil decided to give the fans something extra instead of just a port. And so the director's cut was born, with all its additions and changes to suit an audience you might expect on the Wii and DS and mobile phones. Well, it's kind of hard to say that without sounding sarcastic. It released in 2009, and the following year it released on iOS and got a huge jump in sales and a generally good reception from fans, which pretty much saved Revolution Software from going under and allowed them to continue making games, which is kind of nice. So while I don't like the director's cut, I can't completely hate it either. I mean, it did save a game studio, so that's a good thing. The only thing I did like about the director's cut was the inclusion of a notebook that helps you keep track of where you are in the story, which kind of replaces the scrap envelope that George uses for notes and telephone numbers in the original. Though this way of taking notes probably suits George's character more, as it has its own kind of immersive charm to it. I mean, look, it's got drawings and you can get a sense that George got a little excited with this bit of information. There's even a little Nico face next to her number. And if you play the game, this all kind of makes sense, even though it looks like a child went crazy with a crayon. It adds character to the game that I think got lost a little with the director's cut, which does include things like a hint system that some might find intrusive, but it will probably be helpful for some players, as some of the puzzles were pretty tricky, especially this one puzzle, which the game is famous for, called called the Goat Puzzle. It's rated as one of the most hardest game puzzles ever. Like, this puzzle is so infamous it spawned its own fan group called the Order of the Goat. Apparently a lot of players didn't even finish this game because of this goat. Remember, when this game came out in 1996, there was no quick way to Google for an answer for the puzzle. You had to wait for maybe a gaming magazine or a friend in the know to help you. Thinking back, I also have vivid memories of the first time coming across this goat and just getting absolutely frustrated with it, and just mostly being left on the ground in utter defeat by this puzzle until eventually figuring it out. So when I came across it again in the director's cut, I got a mini PTSD flashback or something, because I was filled with dread and my mind was racing trying to remember how to work out this puzzle again. But in the director's cut, it's now like a nothing puzzle. It's way too easy to figure out, which is maybe great for some people who got stuck here, but the challenge is now completely gone. And what was a very memorable experience before was now completely forgettable, which kinda sucks. Like, I understand why it was changed, and some people really didn't like this puzzle, but there had to be a middle ground somewhere, like a difficulty selector or something. Anyway, the actual solution to the original version of the puzzle is surprisingly easy once you know it. You just... Okay, the rest of the game's puzzles are fairly interesting, and for me it had a nice balance of being frustrating enough that when I googled the solution I didn't feel bad about doing it. Like with most point-and-click adventure games, the main gameplay is figuring out puzzles, while using items in odd but mostly logical ways in said puzzles to progress the story more. There are additional puzzles added in the director's cut which are okay and do fit in mostly with the original, though they do slow the pace compared to the original game a bit too much in my opinion, but if you like puzzles in games you might enjoy them. Things I did like about both versions of the game were the story and characters. The main cast of George and Nico are pretty amusing to watch interact at times, and the oddball characters you find while going through the story are also entertaining. George's reactions to talking to characters can almost be the same as what you're thinking at times, though sometimes George can be a bit of an ass or a bit of a child in his reactions. So for the 90s, a well-rounded character, though he is also persistent and very nosy, which for the conspiracy and crimes he's trying to uncover are really good traits to have. Helping him uncover these conspiracies is Nico, a street-smart photojournalist who tends to be sarcastic and maybe a little short-tempered, but also offering a different perspective and someone for George to play off when figuring out clues. So in the original game we start off with George sitting outside a French cafe and being a little flirty with the waitress, which is shown off in this great animation. And for the director's cut they changed it to this.
My latest discovery was a little cafe, La Chandelle Verte. I was pretty sure the waitress was taking a shine to me.
The animation is so stiff now that George needs to internally monologue so he can understand what's happening in the scene, which is something so simple as being flirty with a waitress. Reminds me of that saying, good storytelling is showing, not telling. And there's a slightly transparent fast forward button there the entire cutscene, which annoys me so much on top of the terrible changes to the animations. Okay, so we're not off to a good start. I'm really trying hard not to bash too much, as I know some of the changes were made for the limitations on the DS and Wii and then mobile phones. But come on, there has to be a better solution than this. Like, some of the scenes from the original game were just touched up at a higher resolution, so why not just do that for the whole scene? Why add this worse version to it that needs a monologue to be understood? Anyway, before I spiral, let's get back on topic. So George is outside a French cafe when along comes a suspicious clown who goes into the cafe and leaves his accordion, while running out with a briefcase that's stolen from another patron. Before George can say or do anything, an explosion destroys the cafe and throws George from his table. A surprisingly unharmed George investigates the area surrounding the cafe and even talks to the waitress, who's pretty shaken by the explosion, but being behind the bar saved her life. While the patron sitting next to the accordion bomb wasn't so lucky. Pretty gripping start to a story, right? Now imagine if instead of that the game started with an interview with a meter tycoon who gets killed by a mime, because that's how the director's cut starts. It's not a bad intro, it's just not as good as the original one, which literally starts off with more of a bang. These added sections where he plays Nico while giving more of her backstory about her involvement doesn't really add anything to the main story. Like, it explains what Nico is up to while George is out doing investigations later in the game, but sometimes it just slows down the story, especially at the start of the game. And some stuff she finds out she doesn't actually share with George, which is okay, cool, so that section was just for more puzzles then, I guess. That's mostly what the director's cut adds. I do like that you get to see Nico's perspective in this edition, but it feels like it's just padding at times and with not actually much added to the story. Other than that, the story is mostly the same between the two versions, except for an odd bit added to the ending, but we'll get to that later. So back to George by the cafe. As he tries to leave the area, he'll run into the police, who will like to have a word with him about what happened and what he saw. This is when George meets this sort of psychic detective Rosso, who questioned him for a bit about what happened, but after a few questions is satisfied that George was not involved and lets him leave the cafe. And George comes across Nico for the first time. He starts a conversation with her, finding out she was going to meet the patron who died in the cafe, who had links to a story she was working on, involving multiple murders in different countries with similar circumstances that had a costume killer as a suspect. Now, most people at this point would leave it up to the police to solve the crime, but George, out of a strong sense of justice and almost being killed, wants to catch the killer himself. And maybe wanting an excuse to get Nico's number, decides to do his own investigating and help Nico find out more about the killer. Searching the area leads to finding the clown escaped escape down an alley which George might vandalize slightly. George will determine that the sewer was how the clown escaped, but gaining access to the sewers is going to require some adventure game logic, involving a newspaper and a construction worker. Solving this will get George into the sewers to find out more clues as to who the killer clown is, which eventually gets you a lead in the clown's tailor, who George questions like he's a noir detective for some reason.
I expect Plantar's a family man, don't you? In their little apartment, Madame Plantar is cooking the supper, listening for the familiar sound of her husband's key in the door. Junior is waiting for his daddy to come home from work. He can't wait to show him the merit marks he earned in school today. Only tonight, Monsieur Plantar won't be coming home.
You forgot the puppy.
Huh?
The faithful puppy dog, waiting for the sound of his master's voice.
Well, maybe they don't have a dog.
Though the tailor doesn't have a clue who George is talking about and is pretty dismissive of George's line of questioning. George does get another lead though, being a shop that the killer clown hired his costume from. But before following up on that, George can visit Nico to update her on what he found while getting to know her a bit better. The interactions they have while going over clues is fairly fun, with George trying to impress her with his detective skills and Nico acting modestly impressed.
I got his tailor's phone number. What's more, I know where he hired the clown suit too.
You had better luck than I did.
But mostly placing his finding of clues as just a bit of good luck. With George feeling strongly there was more hard work than luck. It's entertaining to watch as the story progresses, as they kind of do settle into an old married couple occasionally arguing with each other. With George trying to show off how good a detective he is, while Nico notes his achievements, but not so much as to give him too big an ego about it. This repeats a few times in the game when George makes significant progress. The game will take you back to Nico's apartment to review any new information you found and also to push you where to head next. While it gets a bit predictable, it's an effective way to keep the story going and preventing players from backtracking needlessly. That should be enough if you're interested in playing the game for yourself, so if you don't want spoilers, then go to here. Anyway, so George heads off to the costume shop to get some more information, which leads George to finding out that the killer clown goes by the name Merlin, that George can check with a tailor who will give you an address where the killer clown is staying, a hotel. Going to the hotel, you'll find one of the game's more interesting characters, Lady Piermont, who takes a liking to George. She has some fun bits of dialogue with George. Some other characters you'll encounter at the hotel is a pair of mafia thugs who, if you leave the hotel after entering, will force a search on you trying to find something important. Chatting around the hotel, you'll find that Merlin has a room upstairs. With some help from Lady Piermont, you'll gain access to the room via a narrow balcony. This leads to a close encounter with a killer who George manages to hide from while investigating the room, and finds out that the killer put the contents of the briefcase that was stolen from the cafe in the hotel safe, which is likely what the thugs outside the hotel are after too. Again, with some help from Lady Piermont, you get what's in the safe and sneak it past the thugs outside, which takes you back to Nico's apartment, where you discover that the item is a manuscript with images that relate to the Knights Templar. The images on the manuscript seem to be clues to something, but both Nico and George are not quite sure about what exactly. Though this gives George a chance to show off that he knows how to speak Latin, but it's not enough to figure out what's on the manuscript. However, Nico knows a guy named Andre Labino, an old friend who is a professor at a local museum, who could know more, but George is a little dismissive of him, but follows up on the lead anyway. At the museum, George doesn't find Andre, but is a bit mean to a guard, and finds a tripod which looks exactly like the one on the manuscript. After going back to Nico, they find out that the tripod was discovered in Lochmain, Ireland, by Professor Pegram, who's currently at the dig site where the tripod was found. Also, it seems the professor dropped everything to continue studying this dig site, which makes George suspicious enough to go to Ireland and investigate. This is where you get to see an international map with a bunch of stereotypes on it. Arriving near the dig site in Ireland, you meet some of the locals in and around the bar, including a boy who tells you a sob story about his mother suffering from presumption. We lose more parents that way every year. And another local who's very keen to make a wire necklace for someone. George uses his subtle American charm to find out more about the dig site from the locals.
Top of the morning to you.
I beg your pardon.
Well, that's what you Irish say, isn't it?
Do you want something? Or are you just flaunting your xenophobia?
He eventually finds out about a gem being discovered and that this guy called Fitzgerald worked at the dig site, who is obviously hiding something. Prodding Fitzgerald, you find out that he needs to give something from Professor Pegram to a guy called Marquet. Eventually George makes Fitzgerald so freaked out with his constant questioning that he leaves the bar in a rush, though Fitzgerald gets run over by a car driven by someone in a costume and gets abducted. But Fitzy drops something while being run over. After some point and click puzzle shenanigans in the bar, you find out what he dropped in the basement. Turns out it's the gem, and it looks a lot like the one in the manuscript, so George makes his way to the dig site, which is when he encounters the legendary goat, which, like I was trying to tell you before, is easy to beat, even in the original. All you need to do is... Come on, it's the spoiler section, I can tell them now. No. So once past the goat, George gets into the dig site and does some more puzzling, gaining access to a chamber that leads to another location in Paris called Montfaucon. George meets up with Nico again to share what he knows, and shows off finding the gem. Going to the museum again, you'll get to meet Andre this time, who will give you a lot of information about the Templars past, and a link to Spain that'll be useful in making progress later. Also, Andre sort of gets set up as a maybe romantic rival to George for Nico's affection. This does get hinted at in the story when George chats to Andre more, but it never really amounts to anything. Anyway, George can go to the police and find out more about Marquet, the guy Fitzgerald was supposed to give the gem to. While you talk to the police, you'll note that they've pretty much dropped the cafe murder case, and Rousseau gets fairly defensive when talking about Templars. Probably no connection, right? Anyway, it turns out that Marquet is in a hospital after an attempt on his life, so George, wanting to know more, goes there to find out what he can. George gets a lot of roadblocks put in his way to get to this Marquet guy, including a jealous receptionist, a cleaner who's maybe inhaled too many cleaning supplies, and a really strict nurse, which requires George to be a little underhanded and disguise himself as a doctor and fool some patients. That's not so bad, right? It's not like anyone's gonna die. Okay, so Marquet dies, but not before telling you about the attempt to steal the tripod from the museum by some thugs he's hired. George can try and warn Andre and the guard at the museum about the planned robbery, but they both seem confident in the state-of-the-art alarm system protecting the tripod. So George decides to take matters into his own hands and hides overnight in the museum to catch the thieves in the act. During the robbery attempt, George can skillfully disarm them, well, sort of, but another burglar cosplaying as Catwoman manages to steal the tripod while both George and the thugs are knocked out. After somehow clearing it up with the police, George finds out that it was Nico and the Catwoman cosplay that took the tripod. George is pretty upset with Nico for not telling him her plan, but after being called Georgie once, pretty much drops it. They now have the gem and the tripod, but it didn't seem to do anything by itself. Maybe the Montfaucon place will have some answers. At Montfaucon, George needs to make his way past a French policeman enjoying the performance of a juggler. George doesn't take the juggler too seriously until he's made a fool of by the juggler when he tries to juggle himself, though George turns this into an advantage by outdoing the juggler in a kind of comedy sketch, making the juggler withdraw in shame for some apparent reason. It's not exactly clear. This makes the policeman leave and gives George a chance to venture underneath Paris' sewers once more, where he destroys part of the sewers to gain access to a hidden door that leads to a secret meeting, which George can spy on. While listening, he finds out why people are killing each other over this Templar manuscript. It's a fair bit of exposition, but basically these people are Neo-Templars and are wanting to pretty much take over the world, using various means which they talk about in the meeting. They come from all over the world, one's even from South Africa with a stereotypical thick accent.
The global population's belief in those that govern it has never been lower.
The main topic of the meeting is focused on getting what's called the Broken Sword, which will apparently give them the power to take over the world. The stolen manuscript is important because it has clues on how to find it. They also talk about how their progress keeps getting stopped by a costume assassin trying to keep them from getting closer to it. In the original game, you could walk in on this meeting and have one of the more funnier interactions.
This was it. The conspiracy was revealed.
Okay, nobody move. I'm making a citizen's arrest.
At last, I had them. I could see the fear in their eyes as their little scheme came to pieces.
You're all going away for a very long time. And you can just drop those guns. You're impressing nobody.
Once they leave, you notice that the meeting place might have another use other than being a good setting for a hot fuzz movie scene. Using the gem and tripod here will give you a location in Syria called Marib. At this point in the game, you can either go to Spain to follow up on the information Andre gave you, or head straight to Syria. It adds a nice little illusion of choice that you get to pick where the adventure goes for a bit, but you need to follow up on both to make progress. So in Syria, George gets into a fair bit of hijinks involving American tourists who might be spies, maybe inappropriate conversation with a boy about balls, a toilet brush, and a pretty upbeat taxi driver. Oh, and George vandalizes a toilet. He breaks a lot of things in this game, I notice. With all that going on, he finds out that the assassin is also here in Syria, on the trail of another Neo-Templar called Klausner, who went to a place called the Bull's Head. After some more point-and-click abstract puzzle solving, George manages to get the taxi driver to take him to the Bull's Head, where he finds a hidden cave that he gets locked into. Also, he finds a dead Klausner, who is an Indiana Jones cosplay, but with an important item on him, and a tablet which hints at a location in Britain, also a statue of Baphomet. Before George has a chance to starve to death like Klausner, the door to the cave opens, but it's the assassin holding a gun, and he wants to chat with George for a bit. Now, when I played the original, I remember getting stuck at this part for a bit, because in order to make progress, you need to make the right sort of conversation choices and also do certain things in the right sequence so you don't die. I remember seeing this screen a lot, but if you get it right, George does a dramatic jump off a cliff and into the safety of a taxi driver's truck, which he'll tell Nico about once back in Paris while acting like it wasn't a big deal. The item from Klausner helps with a clue in the church, though George still needs to go and check out Spain, where he needs to figure out how to get past a particularly grumpy gardener and talk to an elderly countess who is pretty gloomy when talking about the Templars, who's linked with her family family have caused some pain. Though George tells her about all the clues linking to the Templars he's found, which piques her interest enough to show George a mausoleum with her ancestors who were Templars in it. Investigating the mausoleum, you find a chess puzzle which gets the Countess out of her gloom and excited about uncovering a mystery. It's one of the nicer moments in the game. Solving the puzzle will result in finding a family chalice which has been missing for a few hundred years, which makes the Countess so happy she holds it up like Link finding something in a Zelda game. George heads back to Paris where he tells Nico about what happened. She oddly gets a bit jealous of the Countess. Anyway, going again to talk to Andre, you chat a bit about that Baphomet statue you saw in Syria, which leads him to tell George about a dig site in Paris, with a statue that's like the one he saw. But before heading to it, George checks up with the priest at the church for some information. Also, the priest wants to polish the chalice you found in Spain for some reason. Once polished, the chalice gives a clue that one of the tombs in the church is linked to the Countess's family, which gives more clues for another puzzle back in Spain. Though, in the director's cut they add a new puzzle in the church section, requiring finding Bible verses with a kind of spray painting mechanic, which was probably for touchscreens. It doesn't translate well to PC and I just wanted to say I hate it. Back to the story, so George heads to the dig site where he needs to puzzle his way past a French painter who knows exactly how to counter George's sarcasm.
I don't think I've ever seen a Gauloise smoked so stylishly.
It's a natural talent.
I'm being sarcastic.
I'm being indifferent.
You're very good at that as well.
And a god who may or may not know what's going on.
What do you know about the Knights Templar?
There was a long pause during which the guard said nothing. Then he said,
Nothing.
Nothing at all?
Is this a test?
What, like a history pop test?
No, like a test.
Okay, yes, it's a test.
Then I know absolutely nothing about the Templars.
Once he makes it past these two using some forgery skills and an assist from Nico, George gets into the dig site where he finds another use for the chalice. It reveals an image of a church with a square tower. It's another location clue, but not enough to know exactly where the broken sword is, so George heads back to Spain to return the very useful chalice. This time the gardener is way happier to see him since he improved the mood of the Countess so much. Chatting a bit more with the Countess, George feels there might be some more clues that the Templars left in the villa. With George being left to wander around, some property damage is bound to happen, which results in him destroying an old priceless candle. Ooh. But there was a clue inside, so the Countess gives him a pass on that bit of vandalism. This clue leads the gardener and George to search for a well on the property, which they come across by accident. In the well is a vault door that if you don't have cat-like reflexes will kill you. Well, only in the original game. In the director's cut they added a puzzle that isn't too tricky to figure out if you look back in your notebook. Though it does feel like you might die from old age because of how long it takes to enter in the right answer. Once in, you get another clue in the location of the broken sword. Back in Paris you chat with Nico at her apartment, though Andre is there going over clues. Everything is civil until George and Andre have a little sarcastic back and forth with each other over George's boasting, which ends when Nico reminds them they have stuff to do. I think this is supposed to be the peak of the romantic rivalry between George and Andre, but I've seen more heated arguments between 5-year-olds. The gang puts together all the clues that the location of the broken sword is a church in Scotland. So George and Nico head out to Scotland and Andre says he can't go for some reason. On the train trip to Scotland a whole bunch of stuff happens. Nico and George confess feelings for each other, and a slightly suspicious old Scottish woman throws some subtle hints that they aren't who they appear to be, which you can figure out if you pay attention. Though the director's cut makes no attempt at hiding who it is, because what's the fun in figuring out stuff in a point-and-click adventure game? Anyway, drama ensues when George leaves the carriage and encounters one of the thugs from earlier in the game. Trying to get back to Nico, he finds it gone and that the rest of the train is locked off. So with some help from a British football hooligan, George makes his way to the roof of the train to find Nico. George finds Nico tied up and the assassin fighting the conductor, though the assassin gets shot and George could be next, though manages with some quick thinking to disarm him. The assassin reveals to George that he's been trying to stop the Neo-Templars from getting the broken sword. He even tells George what the broken sword does. Apparently it empowers a person to have influence over others to a much greater degree than a normal person can. So it's like pure social media power or something. Before the assassin can reveal more, he dies. While Nico is tied up, George decides to steal a kiss, which is a bit questionable, but hey, it's the 90s I guess. They both make their way to the church in Scotland, where you get your last door puzzle. Oh, and Nico points out that the assassin gave us some C4. Also, the church used to store lots of gunpowder hundreds of years ago. I wonder if that's going to come into play. Now, once George and Nico make it into the church, you notice that the Neo-Templars are there already, and mid-ritual praying to the social media power statues, which is a bit of a plot hole considering George and co are the only ones who had all the clues to find this place. This plot hole doesn't really get fixed in the director's cut either. It could have been fixed in a few ways, like the Neo-Templars just quickly mentioning in that secret meeting they had that they found another way to find this place. Or they could have made it so Andre was working for the Neo-Templars in secret, since he's the only other person who knew all the clues. But that might mess up the sequels. Anyway, during the ritual, the Neo-Templars catch George and Nico, who notice that Detective Rosso is one of them. Kinda makes sense why I dropped that case, eh? The leader of the Neo-Templars gets powered up by the statue and tries to convince George to join them, though it doesn't work. Guess that's why it's called the Broken Sword, eh? Rossa has a change of heart because of all the people killed to get here, and frees George and Nico, who make a run for it. On the way out they get cut off by one of the thugs, though if George is quick enough he can throw a torch on all the old gunpowder lying on the floor. When combined with Nico's C4, it can make a pretty big boom. The thug tries to put out the flames, which gives George and Nico a chance to escape, just in time to avoid the worst of the explosion, which demolishes the church. And the game ends with a kiss between George and Nico, with a post-credit message saying there's more adventures to come. Well, that's how the original ended. In the director's cut they added a scene with George and Nico at the Eiffel Tower, with Nico assuring George that there was nothing going on between her and Andre. Like, okay, you had to add that, but you didn't do anything about that biggish plot hole from earlier? I really did try not to bash the director's cut too hard, I promise. So Broken Sword the original was overall an enjoyable game to play, even with how old it is. It tells an interesting story with a setting that's fun to explore, with entertaining interactions between the game's odd batch of characters, with great to somewhat old pixelated animations that made the game feel unique for the time. It's a milestone for the history of point-and-click games, and definitely worth playing if you're into old adventure games. The director's cut is not the worst thing ever, though in my opinion it's not the most ideal version of this game, and the additions it made do more to take away from the experience than they do to add to it. But if you can't play any other version of the game, then I guess it's okay. I should try and be nicer about it. It's pretty cheap on GOG, and the PC version comes with a free copy of the original game, so that's nice. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, consider subscribing. See you next time. You get knocked out by the goat on the right side, then click like mad on the plow thing on the left before getting up and boom, solved.